Thanksgiving was coming up and I was heading to my parents' house for dinner. It's about a 3-hour drive from where I live, so I left early in the afternoon to beat the holiday traffic. The weather was decent, a bit overcast, but nothing too bad for late November. I'd been on the highway for about an hour when I first noticed this dark blue sedan behind me. It wasn't anything special at first, just another car on the road. But after a while I realized it had been following me pretty closely for quite some time. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe they were just in a hurry or not paying attention. As the miles ticked by, though, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. Every time I changed lanes, that car would do the same. When I sped up a little, they matched my speed. It was like they were glued to my bumper. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, trying to get a look at the driver, but the windshield was tinted. I started to feel really uncomfortable. My hands were getting sweaty on the steering wheel, and I could feel my stomach tightening. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing, but no matter what I did, that car stayed right behind me. After another 30 minutes of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to pull off at the next rest stop, thinking maybe I could lose them or at least see who it was. As I took the exit, I held my breath, hoping they'd just keep going on the highway. But no such luck. They followed me off the exit ramp. The rest stop was pretty quiet, just a few cars scattered around the parking lot. I pulled into a spot near the front of the building, thinking there might be some people inside. As I parked, I saw the blue sedan pull in a few spaces away. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I sat there for a moment frozen, watching in my side mirror as the driver's door of the sedan opened. A man got out, tall, kind of stocky, wearing a dark jacket. He just stood there for a second, looking right at my car. Then he started walking towards me. That's when I saw the knife in his hand. It wasn't huge, but the blade caught the light from the parking lot lamps. He was moving fast, coming straight for my door. I could see his face now. He looked angry, determined. His eyes were locked on me. He yelled something. I couldn't make out the words over the blood rushing in my ears, but I knew he was telling me to open the door. I panicked. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key back in the ignition. The man was getting closer, raising the knife. Somehow I managed to start the car. I threw it into reverse, not even looking behind me. I heard a thud. I must have hit a curb or something, but I didn't care. I just knew I had to get out of there. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I could see the man running back to his car in my rearview mirror. I hit the highway going way too fast, swerving around a slow-moving truck. I kept expecting to see those headlights appear behind me again at any moment. I drove like that for what felt like hours, taking random exits, doubling back, trying to make sure I wasn't being followed anymore. Every car I saw made me flinch. I kept checking my mirrors, sure that at any moment I'd see that blue sedan again. I completely lost track of where I was. At some point I realized I had missed the turnoff for my parents' house long ago. The sun was starting to set, and I knew dinner would be starting soon. But I couldn't bring myself to go there. What if he was still out there waiting? What if he followed me and I led him straight to my family? I ended up pulling into the parking lot of some 24-hour diner I didn't recognize. My hands were still shaking as I dug my phone out of my pocket. I called my mom, made up some story about my car breaking down, and told her I wouldn't make it. I could hear the disappointment in her voice, but I just couldn't tell her what had really happened. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, jumping at every car that pulled in. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't gotten away. Why was he following me? What did he want? I kept replaying every moment in my head, wondering if there were signs I missed, things I should have done differently. As it got later, I knew I had to figure out what to do. I couldn't just sit in this parking lot all night, but the thought of driving home terrified me. What if he was out there somewhere, waiting? In the end, I used my phone to find a cheap motel nearby. I took a winding, roundabout way to get there, constantly checking to make sure no one was following me. I barely slept that night. Every sound from the parking lot had me on edge. I kept the curtains closed tight, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out every few minutes, half expecting to see that blue sedan. When morning came, I made the drive home, taking back roads and highways I'd never used before. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. Thanksgiving morning started like any other holiday in our family. The house was filled with the aroma of pumpkin pie and coffee, and I could hear my kids laughing in the living room as they watched the parade on TV. My wife was busy setting the table, carefully arranging the good china we only use for special occasions. Everything seemed perfect, just the way it should be on a holiday. I headed to the kitchen to start preparing the turkey. It was a big bird, about 20 pounds, enough to feed our entire extended family, who would be arriving later that afternoon. I'd done this dozens of times before, so I wasn't particularly worried or stressed about it. Just another Thanksgiving tradition. As I unwrapped the turkey, I noticed it was still a bit frozen in the center. No big deal, I thought. I'd just run it under some warm water to help it thaw faster. I placed it in the sink and turned on the faucet, letting the water run over it while I gathered the rest of the ingredients I needed. I reached for the chef's knife in the block, the one I always use for carving. It was razor sharp. I'd made sure to hone it the night before. I started to prep the vegetables for the stuffing, chopping onions and celery with practiced ease. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the knife hitting the cutting board and the water running in the sink. After a few minutes, I turned off the faucet and lifted the turkey out of the sink. It was heavy and slippery, and as I tried to get a better grip, it suddenly slid in my hands. Instinctively, I reached out to catch it, completely forgetting about the knife in my other hand. In that split second, I felt a sharp, searing pain across my palm. The knife had sliced clean through my hand, from the base of my thumb all the way across to my pinky. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned, watching as blood began to well up from the cut. It took a few seconds for my brain to process what had just happened. Then the pain hit me full force, and I dropped both the turkey and the knife. They clattered to the floor, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was my hand and the alarming amount of blood pouring from it. I grabbed a nearby dish towel and wrapped it around my hand, applying pressure like I knew I was supposed to, but the blood quickly soaked through the thin fabric, dripping onto the kitchen floor. I called out to my wife, trying to keep my voice calm so I wouldn't scare the kids. She came into the kitchen and immediately saw the blood. Her face went pale, and I could see the panic in her eyes. I told her I needed to go to the hospital, that the cut was too deep for us to handle at home. She nodded, already reaching for her phone to call her sister to come watch the kids. I didn't wait for her sister to arrive. The bleeding wasn't slowing down, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. I told my wife I'd drive myself to the ER. It was only about 15 minutes away, and I didn't want to wait for an ambulance. Looking back, that was probably a mistake, but at the time it seemed like the fastest option. I got into my car, struggling to keep pressure on my hand while also trying to drive. The dish towel was completely soaked through now, and blood was dripping onto my clothes and the car seat. I could feel my heart racing, pumping more blood out of the wound with each beat. As I pulled out of our neighborhood, I started to realize just how serious this was. The edges of my vision were getting fuzzy, and I felt cold sweat breaking out all over my body. I turned on the radio, hoping the noise would help keep me alert, but I could barely focus on the words. The familiar street seemed to stretch on forever. Every red light felt like an eternity. I kept glancing at my hand, watching as the blood seeped through my fingers despite my best efforts to keep pressure on it. My whole arm was starting to feel numb and tingly. About halfway to the hospital, things started to get really scary. The dizziness was getting worse, and I was having trouble keeping the car straight on the road. I had to blink hard several times to clear my vision. My thoughts were becoming muddled, and I found myself struggling to remember exactly where I was going. I knew I was in trouble. The possibility that I might not make it to the hospital started to creep into my mind. I thought about my family back at home, waiting for me to return with some bandages and a funny story about how I'd ruined Thanksgiving. The idea that I might not see them again hit me like a punch to the gut. Somehow, I managed to keep driving. Each mile felt like it took an hour, but finally I saw the signs for the hospital emergency room. I've never been so relieved to see a building in my life. I pulled into the parking lot, not even bothering to find a proper space. I just stopped the car as close to the entrance as I could. As I tried to get out, my legs buckled under me. I had to lean against the car to stay upright. The world was spinning, and dark spots were dancing in front of my eyes. I stumbled towards the ER doors, leaving a trail of blood drops behind me. I could see people inside, nurses and patients, but they looked blurry and far away. I raised my hand, trying to signal for help, but my arm felt impossibly heavy. The last thing I remember is the automatic doors sliding open. I heard someone shout, and then everything went black. I collapsed right there in the entrance of the ER, my blood-soaked hand still clutched to my chest. The aroma of roast turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air as I helped my mom set the table for our annual Thanksgiving dinner. Our house was bustling with activity. Aunts, uncles, and cousins were arriving, each bringing their signature dishes. The sound of laughter and animated conversations echoed through the rooms. It was a scene I'd witnessed countless times before, a cherished family tradition that always brought us together. My uncle, a jovial man in his early 60s, arrived with his famous pecan pie. He greeted everyone with his trademark bear hugs and booming voice. I noticed he seemed a bit out of breath, but I chalked it up to the excitement of the day and the chilly weather outside. He settled into his favorite armchair in the living room, joining in the lively discussions about football and politics. As a nurse, I'm usually hyper-aware of people's health, but today I was off duty. I was determined to relax and enjoy the holiday with my family. I pushed aside any lingering concerns and focused on helping with the final dinner preparations. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity as we put the finishing touches on the various dishes. Finally, everything was ready. We gathered around the large dining table, admiring the spread before us. The golden brown turkey took center stage, surrounded by an array of colorful side dishes. My uncle took his usual seat near the head of the table, his eyes twinkling as he surveyed the feast. We all joined hands as my grandfather said grace, thanking God for family, food, and another year together. As we began passing dishes around, the room filled with the clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation. I was in the middle of explaining my latest work project to my cousin when I heard a strange noise from the other end of the table. I looked up to see my uncle's face contorted in what looked like pain. His fork clattered to his plate as he clutched his chest. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Then, as if in slow motion, I saw my uncle slump forward, his head narrowly missing his plate of food. The room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as people jumped up. Someone screamed. But for me, the world suddenly narrowed to just my uncle and me. I was on my feet and moving before I even realized it. My nursing training kicked in, overriding the shock and fear that threatened to paralyze me. I reached my uncle's side in what felt like both an eternity and a split second. I called out his name, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. There was no response. With the help of my father, we carefully lowered my uncle to the floor, clearing space around him. I checked for breathing and a pulse, my fingers pressed against his neck. Nothing. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He was in cardiac arrest. I started chest compressions immediately, the familiar rhythm ingrained in my muscle memory from countless training sessions and real-life emergencies. But this was different. This wasn't a stranger on a hospital bed or a practice dummy. This was my uncle, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had cheered the loudest at my nursing school graduation. I heard someone say they were calling 911, but it sounded far away. My world had shrunk to the rise and fall of my uncle's chest under my hands, the count I was keeping in my head. 30 compressions, then 2 rescue breaths. I tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and breathed into his mouth. His chest rose, but there was no spontaneous breathing. Back to compressions. I could feel the strain in my arms and shoulders, but I pushed through it. I was vaguely aware of my family members hovering nearby, their faces pale and frightened. Someone was crying. I wanted to comfort them, to tell them everything would be okay, but I couldn't spare the breath or concentration. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Each cycle of CPR felt like it lasted hours, yet I was also acutely aware of how quickly the minutes were ticking by. In the back of my mind, I knew that with each passing minute without a heartbeat, the chances of survival decreased. My arms were burning, my back aching from the awkward position on the floor. Sweat dripped down my face, but I couldn't spare a hand to wipe it away. I was dimly aware that my knees were digging into something hard. A shard from a broken plate, perhaps? I didn't care. Nothing mattered except keeping the blood flowing through my uncle's body. I don't know how long I had been doing CPR when I noticed a change. My uncle's lips, which had been taking on a bluish tinge, were now decidedly blue. His skin felt cooler to the touch, and his eyes, God, his eyes. They were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I had seen that look before in my work at the hospital. It was a look I had hoped never to see on a family member. Still, I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Some part of me believed that if I just kept going, if I pushed hard enough, fast enough, I could bring him back. I was vaguely aware of voices around me, telling me the ambulance was on its way, but each minute felt like an hour, and I knew that time was running out. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, when my arms felt like lead and my vision was blurring from exhaustion and unshed tears, I heard the wail of sirens. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a surge of renewed energy. Help was here. We still had a chance. The paramedics burst into the room, their arrival barely registering in my fog of concentration. I rattled off the situation to them automatically. Suspected cardiac arrest. CPR in progress for an unknown duration. They quickly took over, one of them gently but firmly moving me aside. I stumbled back, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion. My arms hung limply at my sides, trembling from the exertion. I watched as the paramedics worked, their movements swift and practiced. They attached the AED, and I held my breath as it analyzed my uncle's heart rhythm. "No shock advised," the machine's robotic voice announced. My heart sank. I knew what that meant. There was no shockable rhythm. The paramedics continued CPR, administered epinephrine, but I could see in their eyes what I already knew in my heart. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few more minutes, the lead paramedic looked up. He shook his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We've done everything we can. He's gone." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees buckle, and someone, my father I think, caught me before I could fall. The room spun around me as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. My uncle, who had been laughing and joking just an hour ago, was gone. The Thanksgiving turkey was still on the table, growing cold. Plates of half-eaten food were scattered around, a stark reminder of how quickly everything had changed. And there, in the middle of our dining room floor, lay my uncle's body, surrounded by the detritus of our failed rescue attempt. Torn clothing, discarded AED pads, empty epinephrine syringes. The paramedics began to pack up their equipment, their movements slow and respectful. They spoke quietly to my parents, probably explaining what would happen next. But I couldn't focus on their words. All I could see was my uncle's face, peaceful now, as if he were just sleeping. I became aware of a stinging sensation in my hands. Looking down, I saw they were raw and red from the repeated compressions. A small cut on my knee was bleeding, probably from kneeling on that broken plate. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I restocked the shelves at the gas station convenience store. It was Thanksgiving night, and I had volunteered for the late shift. The extra holiday pay would help with Christmas gifts for my kids. The store was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional ding of the door chime when a customer came in for last-minute items or to fill up their gas tanks. I'd been working there for about 6 months, and night shifts were usually uneventful. Most customers were truckers passing through or locals who'd forgotten something for their holiday meal. The night was dragging on, and I found myself counting down the hours until I could go home and have my own belated Thanksgiving dinner. As the night wore on, the store became even quieter. I busied myself with menial tasks, wiping down counters, organizing shelves, anything to keep myself awake and alert. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of old pop songs and occasional news updates. I remember thinking how surreal it felt to be working while most people were at home with their families. It must have been around 10 p.m. when the bell chimed, signaling a customer. I looked up from the magazine I'd been flipping through to see a man rush in. He was breathing heavily, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes darted around the store nervously. Something about him immediately put me on edge. He wasn't our usual type of customer, and his demeanor screamed desperation. The man approached the counter, his hands shaking slightly. He explained that his car had broken down about a mile down the road. His family, wife and 2 young kids, were still in the vehicle. He said they were traveling to his in-laws' place for the holiday when their car suddenly died. His phone was dead, and he'd walked to our store, hoping to find help. As he spoke, I felt a mix of sympathy and unease. On one hand, I wanted to help. It was Thanksgiving, after all, and the thought of a family stranded on the side of the road tugged at my heartstrings. On the other hand, something felt off about the situation. The man's story seemed plausible, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made me uncomfortable. I hesitated, weighing my options. Company policy strictly forbade leaving the store unattended, but I also couldn't just ignore a family in need. After a moment's deliberation, I decided to step outside with him to see if I could at least call for a tow truck from my cell phone. I told the man to wait while I grabbed my phone from the back room. As I turned to go get my phone, I noticed the man glance quickly towards the parking lot. It was just for a second, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I paused, suddenly unsure if I should go through with helping him. But before I could change my mind, he pleaded again, describing how cold his kids must be getting in the car. Against my better judgment, I decided to help. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight from under the counter. I told the man to lead the way, thinking we'd just step right outside the door to make the call. But as soon as we exited the store, everything changed in an instant. 2 more men suddenly appeared from the shadows beside the building. Before I could react, one of them grabbed my arm while the other pointed a gun at me. The first man, the one who'd come into the store, now had a gun too. My stomach dropped as I realized I'd fallen for their trap. They forced me back inside the store, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The bell chimed again as we entered, the sound now sinister instead of welcoming. One of the men locked the door behind us while another pulled down the security shutters. The store that had felt so open and safe just moments ago now felt like a prison. The man who'd initially come in, clearly the leader, demanded I open the cash register. His voice was different now, harsh and commanding instead of desperate. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get it open. They shoved me aside once it was open, grabbing all the cash and stuffing it into a bag. But they weren't done. The leader asked about the safe in the back. I told them I didn't have access to it, only the manager did. They didn't believe me. One of them grabbed me by the collar, shoving me against the wall. I could feel the cold metal of the gun barrel pressed against my temple. In that moment, I was sure I was going to die. I tried to explain again that I really didn't have access to the safe, that there was a time lock on it that even the manager couldn't override. They argued among themselves for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide if I was telling the truth. All the while, the gun remained pressed against my head. Eventually, they seemed to accept that they couldn't get into the safe, but their frustration made them more agitated. They started grabbing cigarettes, lottery tickets, anything of value they could easily carry. One of them found the security camera set up and smashed it. Throughout all of this, my mind was racing. I thought about my family at home, probably wondering why I hadn't called during my break like I usually did. I thought about my kids and how they might grow up without a parent if things went wrong. Every sound, the rustling of bags, the click of a gun safety, made me flinch. The leader kept asking if anyone else was expected to come in, if there was a security patrol. I told them no, that I was alone until the morning shift. This seemed to calm them slightly, but they were still on edge, constantly looking out the windows as if expecting the police to show up at any moment. At one point, one of the men wanted to take me with them as a hostage. The idea sent a new wave of terror through me. The leader argued against it, saying I'd only slow them down. They bickered back and forth, and I stood there, feeling like my fate was hanging in the balance of their decision. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, they decided it was time to leave. The leader told me to get on the ground and not move. I complied immediately, pressing my face against the cold linoleum floor. I heard them gathering their bags, the rustle of packaging and the jingle of coins. Then came the sound of the door opening, the bell chiming one last time. I stayed on the ground, hardly daring to breathe. I could hear car doors slamming, an engine starting. The sound of tires on gravel gradually faded away. Even after I couldn't hear the car anymore, I remained on the floor, terrified that it might be a trick, that they might come back. My whole body was shaking, and I realized I was drenched in cold sweat. The floor was uncomfortable, but I didn't dare move. I don't know how long I lay there, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound that might indicate their return. The hum of the refrigerators, which I usually tuned out, now seemed deafening in the silence of the store. Eventually, I slowly raised my head, looking around cautiously. The store was a mess. Products were strewn everywhere. The cash register drawer hung open and empty. Cigarette packs and lottery tickets littered the floor. The broken security camera dangled from its mount, wires exposed. But I was alone. They were really gone. On shaky legs, I got to my feet. My first instinct was to run, to get as far away from the store as possible. But I knew I couldn't do that. I had to call the police, had to report what happened. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone behind the counter. As I dialed 911, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd been robbed at gunpoint. I could have died. The operator's voice sounded distant and tinny as I reported the crime, my own voice sounding strange to my ears as I recounted the events. While I waited for the police to arrive, I locked the front door and pulled down the security shutters. I sat behind the counter, my back against the wall, watching the door and jumping at every little sound. The smell of turkey and pumpkin pie was already filling the house when I woke up on Thanksgiving morning. My parents were bustling around in the kitchen, getting everything ready for the big family dinner later that day. I decided to go for a quick run in the woods behind our house. It was something I often did when I visited home, a chance to clear my head and get some exercise before the inevitable food coma. The air was crisp and cool as I stepped outside. Leaves crunched under my feet as I made my way to the trailhead. The woods were quiet, most people probably still in bed or busy with holiday preparations. I started my usual route, the familiar path winding through the trees. At first, everything was normal. The rhythm of my breathing, the steady pounding of my feet on the ground. I let my mind wander, thinking about the day ahead, the family members I'd see. The trail started to slope upward, and I pushed myself a little harder, enjoying the burn in my muscles. That's when things started to go wrong. I was about halfway through my usual loop when I noticed the trail seemed less maintained than usual. Branches reached further across the path, roots seemed more exposed. I should have turned back then, but I figured I could handle it. I'd run this trail hundreds of times before. I was wrong. As I rounded a bend, my foot caught on something. A root or a rock, I'm not sure. One second I was running, the next I was falling. It happened so fast. I remember a moment of weightlessness, then a sickening lurch as the ground disappeared beneath me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, unable to stop myself. Branches whipped at my face and arms. Rocks and debris battered my body. I tried to grab onto something, anything, but my hands just scraped against dirt and leaves. The world spun around me in a blur of brown and green. Finally, I came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine. For a moment, I just lay there, dazed and trying to catch my breath. Then the pain hit. My left leg was on fire. I tried to move it and nearly blacked out from the agony. I knew immediately that it was broken. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call for help. My stomach dropped when I pulled it out of my pocket. The screen was completely shattered. The case cracked open. It wouldn't turn on. I was alone, injured, and now had no way to contact anyone. Panic started to set in. I tried to calm myself down, to think rationally. Someone would notice I was missing eventually. My parents knew I had gone for a run, but how long would it take them to realize something was wrong? Hours, probably. And even then, would they know where to look? I tried to sit up, to get a better look at my surroundings. The movement sent shock waves of pain through my leg. I bit my lip to keep from crying out. Looking around, I realized how deep in the woods I was. The ravine I had fallen into was steep on all sides. There was no way I could climb out, not with my leg in this condition. I started shouting for help. My voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. Of course not. It was Thanksgiving morning. The trails would be deserted. Everyone was at home with their families, not out hiking in the woods. As time passed, the reality of my situation began to sink in. The pain in my leg was constant, a throbbing ache punctuated by sharp stabs whenever I moved. I was cold, the chill of the ground seeping into my body. My running clothes, now torn and dirty, did little to keep me warm. I kept calling for help periodically, but my voice was getting hoarse. The shadows were shifting as the sun moved across the sky. I had no idea how long I had been there. Hours, probably. My mouth was dry and hunger gnawed at my stomach. I tried not to think about the Thanksgiving dinner I was missing. As the day wore on, my situation became more desperate. The temperature was dropping as evening approached. I could see my breath in the air. My injured leg had gone from painful to numb, which I knew wasn't a good sign. I tried to move around to generate some body heat, but every movement was agony. The worst part was the silence. Apart from the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird, the woods were eerily quiet. No distant sounds of traffic or people. Just me and the growing darkness. I found myself talking out loud, just to break the silence. Describing my surroundings, making plans for what I'd do when I got out of there. Anything to keep my mind off the cold and the pain. As night fell, true fear set in. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Every sound seemed amplified. The hoot of an owl made me jump. I imagined all sorts of creatures prowling in the darkness. Rationally, I knew there was nothing dangerous in these woods, but fear isn't rational. The cold became intense. I was shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. I tried to curl into a ball to conserve heat, but my broken leg made it impossible to get comfortable. I was exhausted but too afraid to sleep. What if I didn't wake up? For the first time, I seriously considered the possibility that I might die out here. The thought was paralyzing. I thought about my family, probably worried sick by now. Were they out looking for me? Would they find me in time? I imagined them discovering my body days later, and the thought made me sick. I'm not sure when I started hallucinating. Maybe it was the cold, or the pain, or simple exhaustion. But at some point during the night, I started seeing things. Flashes of light in the darkness. Voices calling my name. Each time I'd cry out in response only to be met with silence. The disappointment was crushing. The night seemed to last forever. I drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully asleep, but not really awake either. My thoughts became muddled. I couldn't feel my legs anymore, or my hands. In a detached sort of way, I knew this was bad, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I just wanted it to be over, one way or another. As the sky began to lighten, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had survived the night. Surely someone would find me soon. The birds started their morning songs, a welcome change from the oppressive silence of the night. I tried to sit up, to look around, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was so cold, so tired. I'm not sure how much time passed. The sun was fully up now, warming my face. I thought I heard voices in the distance, but I had been fooled so many times during the night that I didn't trust my ears. But then I heard it again. Definitely voices. And they were getting closer. With the last of my strength, I called out. My voice was barely more than a croak, but it was enough. I heard shouts of response, footsteps crashing through the underbrush. And then, suddenly, there were people around me, faces I recognized. My parents, my uncle, others from the search party. Their voices sounded far away, like I was underwater. I felt hands touching me, someone wrapping me in a blanket. The pain in my leg flared as they moved me, but it was distant, unimportant. All that mattered was that I had been found. The aroma of roasted turkey and freshly baked pumpkin pie filled the air as I stepped into my in-laws' house for Thanksgiving dinner. The warmth from the kitchen enveloped me, a stark contrast to the chilly November air outside. Family members bustled about, carrying dishes and setting the table. It was the usual holiday chaos, with kids running around and adults catching up on the latest family news. I made my way to the living room, exchanging greetings and hugs with relatives I hadn't seen in months. The TV was on, showing the annual Thanksgiving Day parade. The familiar sounds of marching bands and cheering crowds provided a comforting background noise to the family chatter. As we waited for dinner to be ready, I helped my mother-in-law in the kitchen. The counters were crowded with dishes: green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and of course, the golden brown turkey taking center stage. The smell was mouth-watering, and my stomach growled in anticipation. Finally, everything was ready. We all gathered around the large dining table, admiring the spread before us. My father-in-law stood at the head of the table, carving knife in hand, ready to serve the turkey. The atmosphere was light and jovial, with jokes being tossed around and compliments on the food flowing freely. As plates were passed around and filled, I found myself growing increasingly hungry. I hadn't eaten much earlier in the day, saving room for this feast. When my plate finally reached me, I eagerly piled it high with a bit of everything. The turkey looked particularly delicious, and I made sure to get a generous portion. Once everyone was served, we began to eat. Conversations flowed around the table, talk of work, school, and plans for the upcoming holiday season. I was only half listening, focused more on the delicious food in front of me. The turkey was perfectly cooked, juicy, and flavorful. In my eagerness to enjoy the meal, I took a large bite of turkey. As I began to chew, I realized I might have been a bit too ambitious. The piece was bigger than I thought, and I could feel it sticking in my throat. At first, I wasn't too concerned. I'd had this happen before. Usually a quick swallow or a sip of water would sort it out. I reached for my glass, taking a sip of water. But instead of helping, it seemed to make things worse. The water couldn't get past the lump of food in my throat. I coughed, trying to clear it, but nothing happened. That's when the first twinge of worry hit me. I coughed again, harder this time. A few family members glanced my way, but their expressions were more amused than concerned. Someone made a joke about me needing to slow down. I tried to smile to play it off, but the growing tightness in my chest made it difficult. As I continued to cough and sputter, I realized with mounting panic that I couldn't catch my breath. Each attempt to inhale was met with resistance. The piece of turkey was lodged firmly in my airway, and it wasn't budging. The conversations around the table began to die down as more people noticed my distress. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My hands went to my throat instinctively, the universal sign for choking. The room fell silent for a moment as the reality of the situation sank in. Then, suddenly, everything erupted into chaos. My wife jumped up asking if I was okay. I couldn't respond. My lungs were burning, desperately trying to draw in air that couldn't get past the obstruction. The edges of my vision started to blur, and a rushing sound filled my ears. I could see the panic in my family's eyes as they realized this wasn't a joke or a minor issue. My brother-in-law, who had some first aid training, sprang into action. He positioned himself behind me and began performing the Heimlich maneuver. His arms wrapped around my midsection, and he started applying sharp upward thrusts to my abdomen. The pressure was intense, almost painful, but I silently urged him to continue. Anything to dislodge the food and let me breathe again. The first few attempts didn't work. I could feel myself growing weaker, my legs starting to buckle. Someone cleared the area around us, pushing chairs out of the way. The rest of the family watched in horror, some frozen in shock, others frantically suggesting what to do. As my brother-in-law continued his efforts, my mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now. surrounded by my family on what was supposed to be a day of celebration. The thought that these could be my last moments was terrifying. I thought of my wife, my parents, all the things I still wanted to do and say. The lack of oxygen was taking its toll. My vision was narrowing, dark spots dancing at the edges. Sounds became muffled as if I was underwater. I was vaguely aware of my body being jostled by the continued Heimlich attempts, but it felt distant, almost like it was happening to someone else. Just as I felt myself starting to lose consciousness, something changed. There was a shift, a sudden give in my chest. With one final powerful thrust from my brother-in-law, I felt the piece of turkey dislodge. It shot out of my mouth, landing on the dining room floor with a wet splat. Suddenly, blessedly, air rushed into my lungs. I gasped, the sound harsh and ragged in the now silent room. I doubled over, coughing and gulping in air. My throat burned, my chest ached, but I could breathe. The relief was overwhelming. As I straightened up, still panting, I became aware of my surroundings again. My family stood around me, their faces a mix of relief and lingering fear. My wife had tears in her eyes as she reached out to steady me. The Thanksgiving table, so meticulously set just moments ago, was in disarray. Plates knocked askew, glasses tipped over, food spilled. I sank into a nearby chair, my legs too shaky to support me. The simple act of breathing, something I'd always taken for granted, now seemed like a miracle. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline still coursing through my system. As I sat there, gulping in air, the reality of what had just happened washed over me. In the span of a few minutes, I had gone from enjoying a family meal to facing the very real possibility of death. The terror of those moments, the burning in my lungs, the panic in my family's eyes, the fading of my consciousness, was etched into my memory. The room around me was a flurry of activity. Someone handed me a glass of water, which I sipped cautiously. Others were cleaning up the mess, straightening the table. My brother-in-law hovered nearby, clearly concerned. I wanted to thank him, to acknowledge what he'd done, but I couldn't find the words. How do you thank someone for saving your life? As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I became aware of the conversations happening around me. Family members recounting what had happened, expressing their shock and relief. The children, who had been ushered out of the room during the incident, were asking questions in hushed tones. The Thanksgiving feast, which had been the center of our attention just moments ago, now seemed unimportant. The roads were quiet as I left my in-laws' house after Thanksgiving dinner. It was dark, but the sky was clear, and a nearly full moon cast a pale glow over the landscape. I was feeling content, my stomach full of turkey and pumpkin pie. The drive home wasn't long, just about an hour on mostly rural roads. As I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed a slight chill in the air. I turned up the heat in the car and settled in for the drive. The radio was playing soft jazz, and I hummed along absent-mindedly. The first few miles were uneventful. Houses decorated with Thanksgiving lights passed by, and I caught glimpses of families still gathered around their dining room tables. About 15 minutes into the drive, I hit a stretch of road that cut through a densely wooded area. The trees loomed on either side, their bare branches creating eerie shadows in my headlights. I'd driven this road countless times, but something felt different that night. The shadows seemed deeper, the darkness more oppressive. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to too much food and the late hour. But as I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something in the road ahead. At first I thought it was a deer. They were common in these parts. But as I got closer, I realized it was a car, swerving erratically across both lanes. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. The car ahead was moving slowly, then speeding up, then slowing down again. It veered dangerously close to the shoulder before suddenly swerving back into the center of the road. My first thought was that the driver must be texting or distracted, but as I watched, a sinking feeling grew in my stomach. This wasn't distracted driving. This was drunk driving. I slowed down, trying to keep a safe distance. Part of me wanted to pull over and wait for the car to pass, but there was nowhere to safely stop on this narrow, winding road. I thought about calling 911, but my phone was in my bag on the passenger seat, out of reach. For several tense minutes, I followed the erratic car, my nerves on edge. Every time it swerved, I flinched, expecting a crash. I started looking for landmarks, trying to figure out exactly where we were so I could report it if needed. But in the darkness, everything looked the same, just endless trees and the occasional reflective road sign. Suddenly, the car ahead sped up dramatically. It shot forward, fishtailing slightly, and disappeared around a curve. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe they'd realized how they were driving and decided to pull over. Or maybe they'd reached their destination. Either way, I was relieved to have the road to myself again. But my relief was short-lived. As I came around the curve, my headlights illuminated a terrifying scene. The drunk driver's car was sideways across both lanes, and it was coming straight at me. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could see the other driver's face, a mask of confusion and terror. I could see the interior light of their car illuminating empty beer cans on the passenger seat. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, trying desperately to avoid a collision. My tires hit the gravel shoulder and I felt the car start to slide. I tried to correct, but it was too late. The world outside my windows became a blur of trees and moonlight as my car left the road entirely. The first impact was jarring. My seatbelt locked, slamming me back against the seat. Then came a moment of weightlessness as the car began to roll. Each impact was accompanied by the sound of crunching metal and shattering glass. I was aware of my body being thrown around despite the seatbelt. Something struck my head, the side window, I think, and my vision blurred. I'm not sure how many times the car rolled. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a matter of seconds. When the motion finally stopped, everything was silent. It took me a moment to realize that the car had come to rest upside down. I was hanging from my seat, the seatbelt digging painfully into my shoulder and chest. As my senses slowly came back to me, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a sharp chemical odor that I recognized immediately. Gasoline. Fear shot through me as I realized the danger I was in. If there was a spark, if anything caught fire, the car could explode with me trapped inside. I tried to move, to unbuckle my seatbelt, but pain shot through my left arm when I tried to lift it. In the dim light, I could see that it was bent at an unnatural angle, probably broken. With my good arm, I fumbled for the seatbelt release, but my fingers felt clumsy and uncoordinated. The button seemed impossibly small. As I struggled with the seatbelt, I became aware of a sound in the distance, an engine revving, tires squealing. The drunk driver. They were leaving. In that moment, a wave of anger and disbelief washed over me. They had caused this, and now they were running away, leaving me trapped and injured. The sound of the other car faded into the distance, and I was left with silence. Well, not complete silence. I could hear liquid dripping somewhere. More gasoline, I feared. And there was a faint hissing sound that I couldn't identify. The airbag, maybe? I wasn't sure if it had deployed or not. Everything had happened so fast. I renewed my efforts to free myself from the seatbelt, ignoring the pain that shot through my body with every movement. After what felt like hours but was probably only a minute or two, I managed to hit the release. I fell awkwardly, my head and shoulders hitting the roof of the car, which was now the floor. The new position brought fresh waves of pain, but also a surge of adrenaline. I had to get out. The smell of gasoline was getting stronger, and the car felt like a death trap. I turned my head, trying to get my bearings. The driver's side window was shattered, leaving a jagged opening. It wasn't large, but it might be big enough for me to squeeze through. I started to move towards the window, but quickly realized a new problem. My legs were pinned under the crushed dashboard. I could move them a little, so I didn't think they were broken, but I couldn't pull them free. Panic started to set in as I realized how truly trapped I was. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. Someone would come along eventually. This road wasn't heavily traveled, especially late at night, but it wasn't completely abandoned either. But how long would it take? And what if the car caught fire before then? I started to shout for help, even though I knew it was likely futile. My voice sounded strange in the confines of the wrecked car, hoarse and frightened. I kept at it until my throat was raw, alternating between calls for help and attempts to free my legs. Time became meaningless as I lay there. I had no idea how long it had been since the crash. My phone had been thrown somewhere during the rollover, so I couldn't check the time or call for help. Every sound made me flinch. A branch creaking in the wind became the car shifting, ready to burst into flames. A distant animal cry became the sound of tearing metal. The pain in my arm had settled into a constant throbbing, and I was starting to feel cold. Shock, probably. I tried to stay awake, afraid that if I lost consciousness, I might never wake up. To keep myself alert, I started talking out loud, describing my surroundings, making plans for what I'd do when I got out. Anything to keep my mind active. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I heard it. A faint sound in the distance growing louder. An engine. A car was coming. I started shouting again, my voice cracking with the effort. The sound grew louder, and then I saw headlights sweeping across the trees above me. The car slowed, and I heard voices, people shouting, asking if anyone was there. I yelled back, trying to guide them to me. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and then there were faces peering in through the shattered window. Someone was telling me to hold on. That help was on the way. The next part is a blur in my memory. There were more voices, the sound of radios crackling. At some point, I heard sirens in the distance. The rescue workers talked to me constantly, asking me questions, telling me what they were doing. They were going to cut me out of the car, they said. I just had to hold on a little longer. The sound of metal cutting through metal was deafening. Sparks flew, and I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified that this would be what finally ignited the gasoline. But the rescuers seemed to know what they were doing. They worked quickly and carefully, and gradually I felt the pressure on my legs ease. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they were ready to pull me out. Hands reached in, supporting my neck and back as they eased me out of the wreckage. The cold night air hit me like a shock as I emerged from the car. I was placed carefully on a backboard, then lifted onto a stretcher. As they wheeled me towards the waiting ambulance, I caught my first glimpse of the accident scene. My car was barely recognizable, a twisted heap of metal at the bottom of a small ravine. The area was lit up with the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Police officers were taking statements from the people who had found me. The paramedics were asking me questions as they loaded me into the ambulance, but I was barely listening. As the doors closed and we began to move, all I could think about was how close I had come to death, trapped in that upside-down car. Thanksgiving evening had settled over our neighborhood, the air crisp with the promise of winter. The streets were quiet. Most families still gathered around their dinner tables, savoring the last bites of pumpkin pie. I stood in my kitchen, tying off a garbage bag filled with the remnants of our own feast, turkey bones, crumpled napkins, and empty cranberry sauce cans. As I stepped out onto my front porch, the cold air hit my face, a stark contrast to the warmth of my home. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the row of houses, their windows glowing with warm light. I could hear the distant sound of laughter from a neighbor's house, probably some post-dinner party game. I made my way down the driveway, the wheels of the garbage can rumbling loudly in the quiet night. As I reached the curb, something caught my eye. Across the street, 2 houses down, a door stood ajar. It was my elderly neighbor's house, the porch light flickering weakly. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was airing out the house after cooking all day. But as I stood there, garbage bag in hand, something felt off. I'd known my neighbor for years. She was always so careful, so particular about her home. Leaving the door open like that, especially on a cold night, it just wasn't like her. I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let up. I set the garbage bag down by the can and crossed the street. As I got closer to her house, I noticed other things that seemed out of place. Her newspaper from that morning was still in the driveway. The curtains, which she usually opened every morning without fail, were still drawn. Standing at the bottom of her porch steps, I called out. No response. I climbed the steps, the old wood creaking under my feet. The flickering porch light cast strange, moving shadows across the front of the house. I called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. I pushed the door open wider, peering into the darkened entryway. The house was silent, save for the soft ticking of a clock somewhere inside. A musty smell wafted out, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. I took a step inside, my hand fumbling along the wall for a light switch. As the hallway light flickered on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the hallway, just visible from where I stood, was a pair of slippered feet, motionless on the living room floor. I rushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I entered the living room, the full scene came into view. My neighbor lay on the floor, her body twisted at an odd angle. Her eyes were closed, her skin pale and waxy in the harsh overhead light. For a moment I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, training from a long-ago first aid course kicked in. I knelt beside her, my hand shaking as I reached for her wrist to check for a pulse. It was there, but weak and thready. I leaned close to her face, feeling for breath. It was shallow, barely there, but she was breathing. I fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it in my haste to dial 911. As I waited for the call to connect, I looked around the room, trying to piece together what had happened. A tipped-over step stool lay nearby. On the coffee table, a half-empty glass of water sat next to a scatter of pills. How long had she been lying here? The 911 operator's voice snapped me back to the present. I quickly explained the situation, my words tumbling out in a rush. They asked me to stay on the line and check for any obvious injuries. As I looked closer, I noticed a large bruise forming on the side of her head. Had she fallen? Hit her head on the coffee table? Following the operator's instructions, I carefully rolled my neighbor onto her side, into the recovery position. Her skin felt cool to the touch, and I noticed her lips had a slight bluish tinge. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but each second felt like an eternity. As I waited, I became acutely aware of the silence in the house. The ticking clock seemed to grow louder, marking each moment that passed. I found myself talking to my neighbor, urging her to hang on even though I wasn't sure she could hear me. I looked around the room, searching for clues about how long she might have been there. The TV was off, but the remote lay on the floor near her hand as if she'd dropped it. On the side table, a cup of tea had long since gone cold, a thin film forming on its surface. The realization that she might have been lying here for hours, maybe even days, hit me like a physical blow. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through my thoughts. I rushed to the front door, flicking on the porch light and opening the door wide. The ambulance pulled up, its flashing lights painting the quiet street in surreal shades of red and blue. Neighbors began to appear on their porches, curious and concerned. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, gently but firmly asking me to step aside as they entered the house. I watched as they knelt beside my neighbor, their voices low and urgent as they assessed her condition. They asked me questions, her name, age, any medical conditions I knew about. I answered as best I could, feeling woefully unprepared. As they worked, I couldn't help but notice the details of the scene. The family photos on the walls, smiling faces looking down at the chaos below. The half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, pen still resting where it had been set down. The calendar on the wall, days crossed off up until 2 days ago. Had she really been lying here for that long? The paramedics moved quickly, attaching monitors, starting an IV, preparing her for transport. I heard snatches of their conversation, words like dehydrated and hypothermic, that made the severity of the situation all too clear. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, I saw her face clearly for the first time since I'd found her. In the harsh light of the ambulance, she looked small and fragile, so different from the vibrant woman I was used to seeing tending her garden or chatting with neighbors. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and confused, before closing again. They wheeled her out of the house, the stretcher bumping slightly as it went down the porch steps. I followed them out, standing on the porch as they loaded her into the ambulance. The neighbors who had gathered watched in silent concern, some still in their dinner clothes, others hastily wrapped in coats against the cold. As the paramedics finished securing the stretcher, one of them turned to me. He asked if I wanted to ride with them to the hospital. I hesitated, looking back at my own house where I knew my family was waiting, probably wondering where I'd disappeared to. but the thought of my neighbor alone in that ambulance made the decision for me. I nodded, following the paramedic to the ambulance. As I climbed in, I caught one last glimpse of the neighborhood. The porch lights were on up and down the street now, concerned faces peering out of windows and doorways. The garbage bag I'd left by the curb still sat there, a mundane reminder of how quickly an ordinary evening could turn into something so frightening. The ambulance doors closed with a solid thunk, and we were moving. The siren wailed to life, eerily loud inside the vehicle. I sat on a small bench, trying to stay out of the way as the paramedic continued to work. The monitors beeped steadily, numbers and lines that meant little to me, but seemed to hold my neighbor's life in their digital display. As we sped through the darkened streets, I found myself going over the events of the evening in my mind. The simple act of taking out the trash, the open door that had caught my eye, the horrible discovery inside. It all seemed surreal now, like a scene from a movie rather than something that had actually happened to me. The ambulance turned a corner sharply, and I had to brace myself to keep from sliding off the bench. The motion seemed to rouse my neighbor. Her eyes opened again, confusion and fear evident in her gaze. She tried to speak, but the oxygen mask muffled her words. The paramedic leaned in, speaking softly to her, reassuring her. I watched, feeling helpless, as she slowly calmed under his care. As we neared the hospital, the paramedic began speaking rapidly into his radio, relaying information to the emergency room staff. The ambulance slowed, then came to a stop. The back doors flew open, and suddenly we were surrounded by a flurry of activity. The stretcher was quickly unloaded, and I scrambled to follow as they wheeled it rapidly towards the emergency room doors. I jogged alongside, trying to keep up, watching my neighbor's face. Her eyes were open now, darting around in confusion and fear. As we passed through the automatic doors into the brightly lit emergency room, she reached out a shaky hand. Without thinking, I took it, giving it a gentle squeeze. For a moment, her eyes focused on mine, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. Then we were through another set of doors, and a nurse was gently but firmly telling me I couldn't go any further. The house was bustling with activity, aunts and uncles catching up, cousins laughing over old stories, and the younger kids running around, their excitement palpable. It was the kind of scene you'd expect to see on a greeting card, warm and familiar. As the adults settled around the dining room table, the kids, full of energy from too much sugar and not enough supervision, decided to start a game of hide and seek. My nephew, a mischievous 5-year-old with a gap-toothed grin and an uncanny ability to squeeze into the smallest spaces, was particularly excited. He'd been boasting all day about how he was the best at hiding, and now was his chance to prove it. We adults barely noticed as the children scattered, too engrossed in our conversations and the feast before us. The sound of little feet pattering across hardwood floors and muffled giggles faded into the background of our Thanksgiving chatter. It wasn't unusual for the kids to entertain themselves during these gatherings, and hide and seek seemed like a harmless way to keep them occupied. As we finished our meal and moved on to dessert, I noticed my sister glancing around the room, a slight frown creasing her forehead. She asked if anyone had seen her son recently. At first, no one thought much of it. Kids get caught up in their games after all, but as minutes ticked by and he didn't appear, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the room. My sister stood up, her voice taking on an edge as she called out for her son. The other children emerged from their hiding spots, but my nephew was nowhere to be seen. That's when the first tendrils of unease began to creep in. We started a casual search, checking the obvious places, under beds, in closets, behind curtains. With each empty space, the tension ratcheted up a notch. Soon, the entire family was involved in the search. We combed through every room, calling out his name, our voices growing more urgent with each passing minute. The other children were questioned, but they hadn't seen him since the game began. One of them mentioned that he had bragged about finding the best hiding spot ever, one where no one would ever find him. As we moved our search outside, the late afternoon sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. We spread out, checking behind bushes, under the porch, in the old treehouse. The neighbor's dog started barking, adding to the growing sense of chaos. I found myself scanning the ground for any sign of disturbed earth, my mind conjuring images I didn't want to acknowledge. With darkness falling, panic began to set in. My sister was in tears, her husband ashen-faced as he coordinated our efforts. Someone suggested calling the police, and the reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was every parent's worst nightmare unfolding in real time. As we waited for the police to arrive, neighbors began to take notice of the commotion. Word spread quickly, and soon our search party had grown to include half the block. Flashlights bobbed in the growing darkness as people checked their own yards and garages. The sense of community was touching, but it did little to quell the growing fear in the pit of my stomach. The police arrived, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. They asked questions, jotting down notes and speaking in low, serious tones. They wanted recent photos, descriptions of what he was wearing, any places he might have gone. As I watched my sister fumble through her phone for pictures, her hands shaking, the gravity of the situation truly sank in. This was real. This was happening. As the search expanded, encompassing more of the neighborhood, I found myself retracing steps we'd already covered, desperate for any clue we might have missed. The beam of my flashlight swept across familiar landscapes now made alien by darkness and fear. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt through me. Could that be him? Was he hurt? Lost? Or something worse? Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had it been hours? Days? The temperature dropped, and I realized I was shivering, though whether from cold or fear I couldn't tell. The streets, usually quiet at this hour, were alive with activity. Cars drove slowly, their occupants scanning the roadside. In the distance, I heard someone calling my nephew's name, the sound echoing eerily in the night. As midnight approached, the police brought in dogs to aid in the search. The sound of their barking added another layer of surreality to the scene. This was the stuff of TV dramas, not real life. Not our life, not our family. Yet here we were, living through every parent's worst fear. The night wore on, and exhaustion began to set in. But no one wanted to stop, no one wanted to rest. How could we, when a child, our child, was out there somewhere? The what-ifs became impossible to ignore. What if he'd been taken? What if he'd wandered too far and couldn't find his way back? What if he was hurt, calling out for help, and we just couldn't hear him? As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, a new wave of dread washed over me. Soon it would be light, and if we hadn't found him by then... I couldn't finish the thought. The police had expanded the search radius, bringing in more officers. They spoke of protocols and procedures, but all I could focus on was the growing look of despair on my sister's face. Just when it seemed like hope was starting to fade, we heard a shout from a few houses down. At first, I thought it was just another false alarm. We'd had several throughout the night, each one crushing our spirits a little more. But this one was different. There was an urgency to it, a note of discovery that sent us all running. As we rounded the corner, I saw a group of people gathered around a car parked in a driveway. For a moment, my heart sank. Had they found something terrible? But then I heard it. A small, muffled voice coming from inside the car. My nephew's voice. We crowded around the vehicle, peering in through the windows. And there, curled up in the trunk, visible through the folded-down back seats, was my nephew. He was alive. He was safe. He had fallen asleep, oblivious to the chaos his disappearance had caused. The car's owner, a neighbor we'd never met before, had gone to leave for an early morning shift and heard a noise coming from his trunk. He'd opened it to investigate and found our missing boy. As the trunk was opened, my nephew blinked in confusion at the crowd of tear-streaked faces staring down at him. He seemed more bewildered by our reaction than anything else. He had, after all, just been playing an extended game of hide-and-seek. Watching as my sister scooped him up, holding him tightly as if she'd never let go again, I felt a wave of relief so intense it made my knees weak. He was okay. He was here. The nightmare was over. The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of roasting turkey and freshly baked pumpkin pie. I'd been up since dawn, preparing for our family's Thanksgiving dinner. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the oven and the occasional crackle from the fireplace in the living room. Outside, a light snow was falling, creating the perfect backdrop for a cozy holiday gathering. As I basted the turkey for what felt like the 100th time, I noticed a dull ache forming behind my eyes. I brushed it off, attributing it to the stress of hosting and the heat from the oven. The day was going smoothly otherwise. The table was set, appetizers were ready, and guests would be arriving soon. My husband was in the living room, watching the parade on TV. I could hear the muffled sounds of the announcers and marching bands. Our 2 kids were upstairs, presumably getting ready. The normalcy of it all was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos that would unfold later. As the morning wore on, I found myself feeling increasingly tired. My movements became sluggish, and I had to concentrate harder on simple tasks. At one point, I nearly dropped a hot dish, my grip suddenly weak. I steadied myself against the counter, a wave of dizziness washing over me. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The first guests arrived, my parents and my sister with her family. As I greeted them at the door, the cool air from outside provided momentary relief from the stuffiness I hadn't realized had built up in the house. My mother commented on how warm it was inside, and I made a mental note to adjust the thermostat. Back in the kitchen, I noticed my sister rubbing her temples. She mentioned having a headache, and I realized mine had gotten worse too. We laughed it off, joking about the stress of the holidays. But there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake. As more family members arrived, the house filled with the usual holiday chatter and laughter. But something was off. Conversations seemed muted, as if everyone was speaking through a fog. I found myself having to ask people to repeat themselves more often than usual. My husband came into the kitchen, looking pale. He mentioned feeling nauseous and dizzy. A knot of worry began to form in my stomach. I was just about to check on the kids upstairs when a shrill beeping cut through the air. At first, I thought it was the oven timer, but the sound was different, more urgent, more insistent. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the carbon monoxide detector in the hallway. For a second, I just stood there, my foggy brain trying to process what was happening. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, adrenaline surged through me. I rushed to the detector, my heart pounding. The small screen was flashing a warning. Dangerous levels detected. I called out to everyone, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. People looked at me with confusion, their reactions slow. I realized with growing horror that we had all been breathing in the poisonous gas for hours. The next few minutes were a blur of action. I started ushering people towards the front door, my words slurring as I tried to explain the danger. Some family members seemed to grasp the situation quickly, while others moved with frustrating slowness, still not comprehending the urgency. I ran upstairs to get the kids, taking the steps 2 at a time despite the dizziness that threatened to topple me. I found them in their rooms, both looking pale and confused. My daughter was lying on her bed, complaining of feeling sick. My son was at his desk, his head in his hands. The realization of how close we had come to tragedy hit me like a physical blow. Getting them downstairs was a challenge. My daughter could barely walk, and I had to half carry her. My son stumbled along behind us, using the wall for support. The stairs seemed endless, each step a monumental effort. Back on the ground floor, I saw that most of the family had made it outside, but my elderly aunt was still in the living room, looking disoriented and refusing to leave her comfortable chair. My husband, despite his own weakness, was trying to convince her to move. I could see the frustration and fear in his eyes as he gently but firmly helped her to her feet. As we finally got everyone out onto the front lawn, the cold air hit us like a slap. Some family members were on their hands and knees in the snow, gulping in the fresh air. Others were swaying on their feet, looking like they might collapse at any moment. I did a quick head count, my heart racing until I was sure everyone was accounted for. Someone had called 911 and I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. The flashing lights of the fire trucks appeared at the end of our street, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. As the firefighters approached, their faces grim behind their masks, the full weight of what had almost happened began to sink in. The firefighters quickly took control of the situation, checking each of us for signs of severe carbon monoxide poisoning. They asked questions that I struggled to answer. How long had we been feeling symptoms? When was the last time we had our furnace checked? My mind felt like it was wading through molasses, each thought an effort. 2 firefighters entered our house, equipped with breathing apparatus and detection equipment. The wait seemed interminable. I watched the door, willing them to come out to tell us it was all a mistake. But deep down I knew. I knew how close we had come to not waking up at all. When they emerged, their expressions were serious. They confirmed what the detector had warned: dangerously high levels of carbon monoxide throughout the house. They had traced it to a major leak in our furnace. As they explained the situation, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air around us. The paramedics arrived shortly after and began treating those with the most severe symptoms. My daughter and elderly aunt were among the first to be given oxygen. The relief on their faces as they breathed in the pure air was palpable. One by one, family members were checked and treated, some requiring more intensive care than others. As I watched the emergency personnel work, the reality of our near miss hit me in waves. The Thanksgiving turkey, now long forgotten, was still in the oven. The pies sat on the counter untouched. The carefully set table stood as a monument to the celebration that almost became a tragedy. All our preparations, all our plans, none of it mattered in the face of what we had just escaped. The firefighters continued their work, ventilating the house and ensuring it was safe. They explained that it would be hours before we could go back inside. As I stood there, watching the flashing lights reflect off the snow, I was struck by the fragility of it all. How quickly our ordinary day had turned into a nightmare, and how close we had come to never waking up. The aroma of roast turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air as I put the finishing touches on our Thanksgiving table. The house was warm, filled with the chatter of my family members who had arrived early to help with the preparations. I smoothed the tablecloth one last time, admiring the way the candlelight glinted off the good china we only used for special occasions. My brother was in the living room, laughing with our cousins over some shared childhood memory. I could hear my husband in the kitchen, his deep voice mixing with the clink of ice in glasses as he fixed drinks for everyone. It was shaping up to be the perfect family gathering, just like we'd planned. As I arranged the name cards around the table, my brother called out from the living room. He had an announcement to make, he said. His voice had that excited edge to it, the one he always got when he was about to share big news. I felt a flutter of anticipation in my stomach as I made my way to join the others. My brother stood in the center of the room, a broad grin on his face. He told us he had invited his new girlfriend to join us for dinner. The news was met with a chorus of excited exclamations from our family. I felt a surge of happiness for him. He'd been single for a while, and I was glad he had found someone special. As the others peppered my brother with questions about his new girlfriend, I noticed my husband had gone quiet. He was standing in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, his face unreadable. I caught his eye, raising an eyebrow in a silent question, but he just shook his head slightly and turned back to the kitchen. The doorbell rang, cutting through the excited chatter. My brother's face lit up, and he practically bounded to the door. I hung back, suddenly feeling a strange sense of unease. The sound of the door opening, my brother's warm greeting, and then a woman's voice, light, melodic, and hauntingly familiar. As my brother led his girlfriend into the living room, time seemed to slow down. I saw her face, and it was like being doused in ice water. I recognized her immediately, my husband's ex, the woman who had nearly destroyed our marriage years ago. She looked exactly the same, her smile just as charming and disarming as I remembered. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I watched as if from a great distance as my brother introduced her to our family. She was gracious, warm, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries as if this was the most normal thing in the world. As if she hadn't once been the cause of so much pain in this very house. I became acutely aware of my husband's presence. He had re-entered the room, and I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. His face had gone pale, his jaw clenched so tight I could see a muscle twitching in his cheek. Our eyes met across the room, and I saw in them a mixture of shock, anger, and something that looked terrifyingly like old pain. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. The cheerful chatter of my family seemed to fade into a dull roar in my ears. I watched as my brother's girlfriend, my husband's ex, moved through the room with easy confidence. She complimented the decorations, admired family photos on the mantel, all while skillfully deflecting questions about her past and how she met my brother. I found myself gripping the back of a chair, my knuckles white with the effort of appearing normal. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of this surreal situation. How could this be happening? How could my brother not know who she was? And how could she stand there, smiling and chatting, acting as if she had never set foot in this house before? As dinner time approached, I mechanically went through the motions of helping to bring dishes to the table. My hands shook slightly as I set down the bowl of mashed potatoes. I could feel my mother's concerned gaze on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. How could I explain what was happening without causing a scene? We all took our seats around the table, a parody of the happy family gathering I had envisioned. My brother's girlfriend, I couldn't bring myself to think of her by name, sat directly across from me, my husband to my right. The tension was palpable, at least to me. I watched as my husband stared down at his plate, his food untouched. As the meal progressed, I found myself hyper-aware of every movement, every word spoken. My brother was oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, happily chatting and keeping the conversation flowing. His girlfriend participated enthusiastically, her charm on full display. But I noticed the careful way she avoided directly addressing my husband, the way her eyes would skitter away whenever they accidentally met his. I tried to eat, but each bite felt like sawdust in my mouth. The food I had spent hours preparing now tasted like nothing. I found myself taking larger sips of wine than usual, desperate for something to dull the edge of this nightmare. As the main course wound down, my aunt asked my brother's girlfriend how they had met. I tensed, waiting for the response. She launched into a story about a chance encounter at a coffee shop, her words smooth and practiced. But as she spoke, I caught a fleeting glance between her and my husband. It was brief, barely noticeable, but loaded with unspoken history. That glance sent a jolt through me. Memories I had long suppressed came flooding back. The day I had discovered the affair, the fights, the painful separation, the months of counseling, the slow, arduous process of rebuilding trust. All of it threatened to overwhelm me right there at the dinner table. I excused myself, mumbling something about checking on dessert. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, taking deep breaths. The sounds of conversation and laughter from the dining room seemed to mock me. How could everyone else be so oblivious to the emotional minefield we were navigating? When I returned with the pumpkin pie, I found my husband engaged in a stilted conversation with my brother's girlfriend. They were discussing her job. Apparently, she was now working in the same industry as my husband. The coincidence seemed cruel, another twist of the knife. As I served the pie, I watched my family's faces. My parents exchanged worried glances, clearly sensing that something was off but unsure what. My cousins seemed uncomfortable, their usual boisterous energy subdued. And my brother, my sweet, trusting brother, beamed at his girlfriend with pure adoration, completely unaware of the history she shared with our family. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. I remember fragments, the clink of forks against plates, muffled laughter, the scrape of chairs as people stood to leave the table. Through it all, I felt like I was underwater. Every sound muffled, every movement slow and dreamlike. As people began to move back to the living room for coffee, I found myself alone in the dining room with my husband. For a moment, we just looked at each other, years of shared history and pain passing between us in silence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking his head slightly. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there among the remnants of our Thanksgiving dinner. The smell of roast turkey and pumpkin pie filled the house as my family gathered around the table for our annual Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone was chatting and laughing, passing dishes back and forth. I was sitting between my mom and my sister, loading my plate with all the usual holiday favorites: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and a big scoop of my aunt's famous green bean casserole. As I started eating, I noticed the green bean casserole tasted a bit different than usual. It had a slightly nutty flavor that I didn't remember from previous years. I figured my aunt had just changed up the recipe a bit, so I didn't think much of it and kept eating. About halfway through the meal, I started to feel a bit off. My mouth felt kind of tingly and my tongue felt thick and heavy. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just eating too fast or something. But as I continued eating and talking with my family, the feeling got worse. My lips started to feel puffy and swollen. I put down my fork and took a big gulp of water, hoping it would help. But as I swallowed, I felt a tightness in my throat. That's when I started to get worried. I've had mild allergic reactions before, but nothing serious. This felt different. I leaned over to my mom and quietly told her I wasn't feeling well. She looked at me with concern and asked what was wrong. As I tried to explain, I realized my voice sounded strange, kind of raspy and strained. The tightness in my throat was getting worse by the second. My mom's eyes widened as she looked at my face. She said my lips looked swollen and asked if I was having trouble breathing. As soon as she said it, I realized that yes, I was starting to have a hard time getting a full breath. Each inhale felt like trying to suck air through a straw. That's when things started to get really scary. My mom jumped up and announced to the table that I was having an allergic reaction. The room erupted in a flurry of motion and voices. Someone asked if I had my EpiPen. With a jolt of panic, I realized I'd left it in my purse in the other room. My sister ran to get my purse while my dad started asking what I'd eaten, trying to figure out what could have caused the reaction. I could barely focus on what anyone was saying. All I could think about was how hard it was getting to breathe. Each breath felt shallower than the last. My chest felt tight, like someone was sitting on it. My sister came back with my purse and handed me the EpiPen. With shaking hands, I tried to open it, but I was starting to feel dizzy and disoriented. My fingers felt clumsy and weak. I fumbled with the packaging, unable to get it open. My mom took it from me and quickly popped off the cap. But as she was about to inject me, she suddenly stopped and gasped. The EpiPen had expired months ago. I'd forgotten to get it refilled after my last checkup. The room seemed to spin around me as the reality of the situation sunk in. I didn't have a working EpiPen and I couldn't breathe. I looked at my family's faces, seeing the fear and panic in their eyes. My dad was on the phone, presumably calling 911. My mom was holding my hand, telling me to stay calm and take slow breaths. But I couldn't. Each attempt to inhale felt like trying to breathe through a pinhole. My vision started to get blurry around the edges. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. A cold sweat broke out all over my body. I genuinely thought this was it. I was going to die right here at the Thanksgiving table in front of my whole family. My uncle suddenly announced he was going to run next door to see if our neighbors had an EpiPen. I watched him sprint out the front door, feeling like I was watching a scene in a movie. Everything felt surreal and distant. I don't know how long I sat there, struggling for each breath. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp. I was vaguely aware of my family around me, my mom rubbing my back, my sister holding my hand, my dad pacing as he talked to the 911 operator. But mostly, I was focused on the increasingly difficult task of drawing air into my lungs. My throat felt like it was closing more with each passing second. I tried to swallow and couldn't. Panic clawed at me as I realized I could barely get any air at all. Black spots danced in my vision. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling like I might pass out. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the front door burst open. My uncle rushed in, followed by our neighbor from 3 houses down. The neighbor was holding an EpiPen. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a new wave of fear. Would it be in time? My mom grabbed the EpiPen and quickly read the instructions. I felt the needle plunge into my thigh. For a second, nothing happened. I sat there, still gasping for air, wondering if it was too late. Then gradually I felt the vice-like grip on my throat start to loosen. It wasn't instant like in the movies. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I was able to take slightly deeper breaths. The relief was indescribable. I slumped in my chair, focusing all my energy on pulling air into my lungs. As I sat there breathing, I became aware of the chaos around me. My family was all talking at once. Someone was wiping my face with a cool cloth. I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. I looked down at my hands and realized they were shaking uncontrollably. My whole body felt weak and trembly, but I could breathe. The tightness in my chest was easing. The swelling in my throat was going down. The paramedics arrived just as I was starting to feel like I wasn't in immediate danger of suffocating. They burst into the dining room, equipment in hand.
One of them knelt beside me, checking my vitals and asking questions about what happened. As the paramedic listened to my breathing and checked my blood pressure, I looked around the room at my family. The table was a mess. Plates of half-eaten food, knocked over glasses, the tablecloth askew. My family looked shell-shocked, their faces pale and drawn. The paramedics said they wanted to take me to the hospital for observation.
As they helped me onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of the Thanksgiving table, the turkey growing cold, the pumpkin pie untouched. What should have been a happy family gathering had turned into a nightmare in a matter of minutes. The leaves were turning golden and red as I drove through my grandmother's neighborhood. It was Thanksgiving morning, and I was on my way to pick her up for our family dinner. The air was crisp, and the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys filled the air. I pulled up to her small, well-kept house just like I had done countless times before. I walked up the familiar path to her front door, my mind already on the delicious meal ahead and the warmth of family gatherings. I knocked on the door, expecting to hear her cheerful voice calling out that she'd be right there. Instead, there was silence. I waited a moment, then knocked again, a bit louder this time. After what felt like an eternity, I heard shuffling footsteps approaching the door. When it finally opened, I was met with a sight that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. My grandmother, usually impeccably dressed and put together, stood there in her nightgown, her hair disheveled. But it wasn't her appearance that truly shocked me. It was the look in her eyes. They were wide and confused, darting around as if she couldn't quite focus on anything. I greeted her with a smile, trying to hide my growing concern. She looked at me blankly, no hint of recognition in her eyes. I gently reminded her who I was and why I was there, but her expression remained vacant. She mumbled something incoherent and turned away from the door, wandering back into the house. I followed her inside, my worry increasing with each passing second. The house, which she usually kept meticulously clean, was in disarray. Dishes were piled in the sink, and I noticed a half-eaten sandwich on the coffee table that looked like it had been there for days. As I tried to talk to her, asking if she was feeling okay, if she had eaten, her responses were disjointed and confused. She kept asking what day it was, and each time I told her, she seemed surprised, as if hearing it for the first time. When I mentioned Thanksgiving dinner, she looked at me with genuine bewilderment, as if the concept was entirely foreign to her. That's when the terrifying thought hit me. Could she be having a stroke? The sudden confusion, the inability to recognize me or understand what was happening, it all seemed to fit. My heart started racing as I realized I needed to get her to the hospital immediately. I tried to explain to her that we needed to go to the doctor, but she didn't seem to understand. When I gently took her arm to guide her towards the door, she pulled away, looking at me with a mix of confusion and fear. It was like looking into the eyes of a stranger, not the woman who had baked cookies with me and told me stories throughout my childhood. Somehow, I managed to get her into a coat and shoes. The whole time, she kept asking who I was and where we were going. Each time she didn't recognize me, it felt like a physical blow. I had to keep reminding myself that something was wrong, that this wasn't really her. Getting her into the car was another challenge. She resisted, becoming increasingly agitated. I had to practically coax her into the passenger seat, all while trying to keep my own rising panic under control. As I closed her door and walked around to the driver's side, I could see her through the window looking around in confusion, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. As I started driving towards the hospital, things took a turn for the worse. My grandmother's agitation increased. She started asking where I was taking her, her voice rising with each question. I tried to explain calmly that we were going to see a doctor, that everything would be okay, but my words seemed to have no effect. Suddenly, she yelled out, accusing me of kidnapping her. The fear and anger in her voice made me flinch. I'd never heard her speak like that before. She demanded that I stop the car, reaching for the door handle. I quickly hit the child lock, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. For the rest of the drive, which felt like it took hours, my grandmother alternated between fearful silence and outbursts of anger and confusion. She kept insisting that she didn't know me, that she needed to go home. At one point, she started crying, asking for her own mother who had passed away decades ago. Hearing her sound so lost and frightened, I had to blink back tears of my own. When we finally reached the emergency room, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. As soon as I opened her car door, my grandmother tried to make a run for it. I managed to gently grab her arm, but she started screaming for help, yelling that I was trying to hurt her. People in the parking lot turned to stare. A security guard started walking towards us. I was trying to explain the situation to him while also attempting to calm my grandmother, who was becoming more hysterical by the second. She was looking at me with such fear and distrust, it felt like my heart was being torn apart. Somehow, with the help of the security guard and a nurse who came out, we managed to get her into the emergency room. But once inside, things escalated even further. The bright lights and busy atmosphere seemed to agitate her even more. She tried to run again, screaming for someone to help her, to save her from me. I watched in horror as my grandmother, the woman who had always been a pillar of strength and kindness in my life, cowered away from me as if I was a monster. She was looking around wildly, her eyes filled with terror, not recognizing anything or anyone around her. When a nurse tried to approach her, she lashed out, trying to push them away. It took several staff members to finally calm her down enough to get her into an examination room. I stood there, feeling helpless and terrified, as they gently restrained her to prevent her from hurting herself or others. Seeing her like that, confused, scared, and looking at everyone as if they were enemies, was one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever experienced. As the doctors began their examination, asking me questions about her medical history and what had happened, I couldn't shake the image of her fearful eyes from my mind. This woman, who had always been my safe harbor, now saw me as a threat. It felt like the world had turned upside down. The next few hours were a blur of tests, questions, and waiting. My grandmother alternated between periods of agitation and confusion and moments of eerie calm where she seemed to be in a world of her own. Each time a doctor or nurse entered the room, she would startle, sometimes trying to get out of the bed, other times shrinking away in fear. I sat in a chair near her bed, feeling completely drained. The sounds of the busy emergency room faded into the background as I watched her, trying to reconcile this frightened, confused person with the strong, loving grandmother I knew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached me with results. As he explained the diagnosis, I felt a mix of relief and disbelief wash over me. It wasn't a stroke. My grandmother had a severe urinary tract infection that had caused a condition called delirium. The doctor explained that in elderly patients, UTIs can sometimes cause extreme confusion and personality changes. As the nurse hooked up an IV to start antibiotics, I watched my grandmother's face. She was calmer now, the sedatives they had given her taking effect. But there was still no recognition in her eyes when she looked at me. The doctor assured me that with treatment, she should return to her normal self. But in that moment, it was hard to imagine. I stood there, watching the IV drip, the steady beep of the heart monitor filling the room. My grandmother had drifted off to sleep, her face finally peaceful after hours of fear and confusion. As I looked at her, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that it wasn't something more serious, lingering fear from the experience we'd just been through, and a deep sadness at seeing her so vulnerable. The doctor touched my arm, telling me that they were going to admit her for treatment and observation. As they prepared to move her to a room, I leaned down and gently squeezed her hand. Even in sleep, she didn't respond to my touch. I straightened up, watching as they wheeled her bed out of the emergency room, the events of the day replaying in my mind. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.